This is my video project on stop and frisk practices. The definition of stop and frisk is the detaining of a person by a police officer and can be accompanied by a superficial examination by the officer of the person's body surface or clothing to discover any objects relating to criminal activity. Here we're going to look at the Supreme Court rulings that shaped stop and frisk. The constitutional standard for stop and frisk was established in Terry v. Ohio in 1968. The decision stated that police can stop citizens if they have a reasonable suspicion that the person committed a crime. It also states that police can search someone outside their clothing if they have reasonable suspicion that that person is armed. However, the decision from Terry v. Ohio did not provide a clear definition of what a stop was. This would later occur in the Supreme Court case United States v. Mendenhall in 1980. This decision states that a person is stopped when a reasonable person would have believed that they were not free to leave based on the circumstances of the stop. The circumstances that indicate a stop are the threatening presence of several officers, the display of a weapon by an officer, physical touching of the person, the use of language or tone of voice indicating compliance with the officer's request, and most often we take into account the duration of a stop, because some stops can be drawn out until it can turn into an arrest, which would need probable cause instead of the reasonable suspicion used in a stop. Let's look at the legality of stop and frisk. In the NYPD, there was an analysis done between the officers and citizens of New York City between April and October of 2022. This study found that officers had a legal basis for only 73% of the total number of frisks that were assessed. In this analysis, it also found a high level of noncompliance with the federal standards set for legal stop and frisk. This included frisks where an officer lifted a person's shirt or unzipped a person's jacket without having probable cause, which is required. An audit on the NYPD and its use of stop and frisk found that officers failed to record these stops up to 73% of the time. We can also see that 90% of stops made by NYPD officers did not lead to a summons or arrest. If you look at the graph over here, you can see that the high number of stops come with a high number of no outcomes, which means no summons or arrest. We can also see that there were very little arrests and summons during this time. Next, let's look at racial profiling with the use of stop and frisk. A dramatic and consistent aspect of stop and frisk is the disproportionate impact on people of color. A study conducted between 2003 and 2022 found that 90% of people stopped by an NYPD officer were people of color. Black and Latinx New Yorkers make up 52 and 32%, whereas white New Yorkers only make up 10% of stops. It has also been found that the New York Police Department has received 1,536 complaints of racial profiling since tracking began in 2015. Another analysis looks at different units in the New York City Police Department. This analysis focuses on a specific unit called Neighborhood Safety Teams. These units are used to combat gun violence in high-crime areas. Reports have shown that officers in the neighborhood safety teams have been stopping, frisking, and searching people at unsatisfactory levels of compliance. A random sample of stops was taken, made by the neighborhood safety teams, and they found that more than 97% of people encountered were Black or Latinx. 83% of these people were men, as well as 1/4 of these frisks lacked reasonable suspicion, and 1/3 of these searches lacked any legal basis. We can also see that crime brings more stops in communities of color than it does in predominantly white neighborhoods. High crime station in predominantly black or Hispanic neighborhoods tend to have more stops than high crime station areas that are in predominantly white neighborhoods. The many stops made in neighborhoods predominantly made up of people of color have been unlawful, and some have even led to violent police misconduct. While looking at this graph, we can see that black people were stopped at a rate nearly 8 times greater than white people, as well as Latinx people were stopped at a rate 4 times greater. We can also see that these racial disparities have remained consistent year to year despite the dramatic drop in stops after 2010. To end my presentation, I would like to look at the current statistics on stop and frisk. According to the New York Police Department's annual report for 2022, it tells us that 15,102 stops were recorded. 9,750 of them were arrested or given a summons. 8,863 people that were stopped were black. 4,477 people that were stopped were Latinx, and only 1,077 people that were stopped were white.